Over the years, Microsoft has released some products that weren't received very well by consumers. We already talked about Windows Me and the Microsoft Kin, but one of the company's earliest and most visible flops was Microsoft Bob, an application for Windows 3.1 that transformed the user interface into one that resembled a real house with objects, each one tied to a computer program. This was intended to make computers and applications easier to understand for new users by giving them a real-world object to relate a computer program to. But today, Microsoft Bob is the subject of mockery and is easily made fun of. Most people remember it as a complete failure, a product that, in fact, made Windows more cumbersome to use. It's been called everything from an operating system designed around Clippy to one of the worst tech products of all time. So how did it garner this reputation? What exactly went so wrong with Microsoft Bob? In today's video, we're going to be exploring the history of everyone's favorite virtual house and examining its origins, development, and its ultimate fate. Let's get started. This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Get a free trial of Skillshare's premium membership for a limited time by following the link in this video's description. Our story begins in March of 1995 with the release of Microsoft Bob version 1.0. This was about 5 months before the launch of Windows 95, meaning that Windows 3.1 was the latest consumer release of Windows. It was a time when computers were still making their way into the homes of everyday people, as only about 1/3 of households in the US had one. And using a computer for the very first time can be a daunting task, especially if it was running a command line based OS like MS-DOS. This is where graphical user interfaces like Windows, GeoWorks, Gem, and others came into play. They utilized a user interface with icons and windows that could be interacted with using a mouse, making the OS easier to use and understand. And it was clear that this was the future of computer operating systems. But there were still certain UI elements that could confuse new users. Things like menu buttons and file browsers, and Microsoft Bob intended to ease this confusion by transforming the entire user interface into one that was more relatable. The idea for what would eventually become Microsoft Bob was conceived by two Microsoft employees, Barry Lynette and Karen Fries. The two previously worked on Microsoft Publisher, which was released as a standalone application in 1991. It would eventually become a part of Microsoft Office and still is to this day. Publisher was the very first Microsoft program to include wizards. You know, those programs that walk you through setup processes or certain functions of a program. Publisher utilized these wizards during the document creation process. You can select the type of document that you want, like a calendar, newsletter, or brochure, and the program will bring up the page wizard, which lets you customize the design and layout of the document, simplifying an otherwise complicated process. This was another initiative at Microsoft that was designed to make computer applications easier to use, but Lynette and Fries felt that this wasn't enough for novice computer users. In an email, Fries argued that software, even though the design of user interfaces was improving day by day, was actually becoming more complex to use, with all of the functions and menu options to figure out. She equated application menus to a restaurant menu, which displays many food options to the customer and requires them to make a choice. And she contrasted this with a recipe book, which gives specific instructions on how to make food, and pointed out that in most sit-down restaurants, you can ask the waiter for help on deciding between two menu options. These ideas would inspire the creation of Microsoft Bob and its virtual assistant, although it took a lot of convincing for the company to greenlight the project. Bill Gates was curious about the idea, but wanted to see a few practical uses for it. He eventually gave the okay to the product's development, though only with a 3-person team. Later on, this was expanded to 12 people and then 35, making a full Microsoft development team. This team included Bill Gates' future wife, Melinda, who served as the project's marketing manager. The goal? To create an all-new user interface that would run on top of Windows with the purpose of making the OS easier to navigate. It's easy to look at Microsoft Bob today and consider it comical, but creating Microsoft Bob required a large amount of research and development, and not only on Microsoft's part. Development began in the early 90s with the help of two professors from Stanford University, Byron Reeves and Clifford Nass. They didn't serve as software developers on the Bob product team, but rather consultants who had conducted social experiments on the effects of user interface design on computer users. They discovered that users responded better to social interfaces, ones that were more relatable. They also found that the design of application windows and message boxes can have an effect on usability. It may not be surprising to hear today, but this was the early 1990s. Graphical user interfaces looked way different than they do now, and Windows itself technically was not an operating system yet, but rather an operating environment that ran on top of MS-DOS. So development of the new project was underway, but it wouldn't get the name Microsoft Bob until a few months before it was demonstrated publicly. The software was initially given the codename Data Wizard, but this was later changed to Utopia. In fact, you can see references to Utopia in the final release of Microsoft Bob, as many of the application files carry this name. The company eventually decided on Bob for the final release name since it sounded friendly. Yeah, there was no acronym or anything like that, the name just sounded good. At the annual Consumer Electronics Show in 1995, Bill Gates demoed Microsoft Bob for the first time. There was a lot of hype around the program, and many felt that Bob's social interface was the future of computer GUIs. Even Bill Gates himself appeared enthusiastic about it, saying that Bob is the next major evolutionary step in interface design. He further claimed that the next generation of personal computers would use social interfaces similar to Bob's. My favorite quote by far is from an analyst who said that Microsoft Bob is going to be another nail in Apple's coffin. Others were not as convinced though. Ben Schneiderman commented on Bob's virtual assistant, saying, "Maybe it's cute the first time, but it's silly the second time and an annoying distraction the third time." But one of Bob's largest problems was its hardware requirements, which were pretty high for the time. It needed a 486 processor and 8 megabytes of RAM. This was at a time when 4 megabytes of RAM was more commonplace. Despite these concerns, Bob was made available 3 months after its announcement in March of 1995 for a price of $99, although it was eventually bundled with certain computers from OEMs like Gateway, who even had their own special version of the program. So, let's take a look at it. One of the first things you'll notice when using Microsoft Bob is that the program over-explains things and makes changes to simple things like button placement that can throw off a person just slightly familiar with Windows. This is first evident during the setup process, where the typical Next button on one screen is changed to a larger button with the Bob logo inside. So if you were used to having your mouse positioned at the bottom right of the window over where the Next button would normally be, you may end up clicking something you didn't want. Unlike alternative shells for Windows like Packard Bell Navigator, which I did a video on here, Microsoft Bob does not replace the Program Manager or Windows Explorer. It will start up after the main shell is loaded. You'll be greeted with a front door, and Rover the dog, Bob's default virtual assistant, will make his way onto the screen. He'll walk you through making a user account, and when asked to type in your password, Rover will explain that the small symbols that display instead of your password is his way of disguising it. Yet another example of what I mentioned before. You'll then enter the Bob house and be presented with the main user interface. In Bob, your desktop takes the form of a room, and your icons, virtual objects. Clicking on one of these objects lets you open the associated program, of which there are many. The theory was, using virtual objects that look like something you would find around your house would make new users easily understand what each program did. For example, the letter writer is represented as a pen and paper sitting on a table. There's also a calendar, checkbook, finance application, and even a virtual edition of Geo Safari. This is one of the few programs that has its own dedicated virtual assistant, in this case, Hank, who will be on the screen only when you're using Geo Safari. It's the same story with the finance program, where a talking book named Lexi will guide you through managing your checkbook and balancing your budget. There's a lot of customizability in Bob. You can arrange these objects however you want and resize them to your liking. If you use the particular program more often, you might want to make it larger so it can be more accessible. But you can also rearrange objects that are not tied to a program at all, like chairs and tables, which can lead to some pretty crazy layouts. And this is just one of the many rooms that Bob has. You can access other rooms by clicking on one of the doors. Each one is designed after a room that would be in a real home. So you've got a living room, a study, garage, even a mouse hole, and a safe. Bob also allows each user to choose their own room that is accessible only by them. The room type is chosen during the user account creation process. The Gateway 2000 edition of Bob includes unique, farm-themed rooms that are only found in that edition of the program. Another useful thing you can do with Bob is create shortcuts to regular Windows programs. These are displayed as simple boxes with the application icon on the front. Now, I'm sure that some who have never heard of Microsoft Bob may look at this user interface and immediately think, oh, this is some children's program. But this is not the case at all. Bob came with programs like the Financial Guide and even an estate planner. And being thought of as a children's program by some was problematic for a computer application that was meant to be taken seriously. As one journalist put it, unfortunately, the room metaphor, as well as Bob's characters, seem to come straight from kindergarten. They're drawn as if the program's target audience were the under 12 set, and much of their behavior will be unappealing to people seriously bent on getting a lot out of their PCs, or to adults of any kind for that matter. One of the aspects of Bob that is often mentioned in criticism of the program is the virtual assistant, because it could become more of an intrusion very quickly. Going back to the quote I mentioned earlier, instead of prompts being displayed at the center of the screen, they are displayed as speech bubbles coming from the virtual assistant. And this can become rather annoying when working in an application and being forced to acknowledge a prompt that is at the bottom right of your screen. Because if the virtual assistant displays a message with an OK button, you have to click it. You are literally prevented from doing anything else in the application until you do so. But Microsoft was betting on the assistant. In fact, they even applied for and eventually received a patent for the technology. And there wasn't just Rover. Bob came with multiple virtual assistants, each with a bit of a different personality. Some were more helpful than others. And if you wanted absolutely no help at all, you could choose the Invisible Assistant. Another, more interesting program that Microsoft Bob included was an email service. It was powered by MCI Mail, and to sign up, you had to make a phone call to a 1-800 number. You would then be sent a welcome kit from MCI. An account cost $5 per month, and you were limited to sending only 15 emails each month. This definitely wouldn't last in today's world, but I always wondered what happened to the people who actually used this service. You see, Microsoft owned the bob.com domain at this time, which is what was used to create your email address. But in 1999, years after the demise of Microsoft Bob, the company actually traded the bob.com domain to someone named Bob, who, interestingly enough, owned windows2000.com, which was then given to Microsoft as a part of the agreement. So what happened to the people who had an @bob.com email address? Were they able to migrate their inbox to Hotmail, which Microsoft owned at this time? Did they have to switch to another MCI domain? Or did they just lose all of their emails? It's an answer that I wasn't able to find, but if anyone watching ever used this service, be sure to let us know what your experience was like and ultimately what happened with your account. Before we move on, I want to give a huge thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring today's episode. Skillshare is the online learning community that gives you the tools to boost your creative skills through interactive video lessons. Whether you're wanting to learn a new skill or brush up on a topic that you already know, I'd recommend checking out their wide range of classes on productivity, creative writing, and video editing, just to name a few topics. But that doesn't even scratch the surface of what Skillshare has to offer. Maybe you're thinking of getting into video editing, and if so, check out this Skillshare class from Sean Dykink that gives some great tips on creating visually appealing video projects. You'll even be able to download the assets used in the video lessons, so that you can follow along and maybe get creative with your own edits. Most of these classes are under an hour in length and are split up into multiple sections for more convenient viewing. And since Skillshare is a learning community, you can chat with other users taking the same class and read feedback from people who have already finished it. With Skillshare's Premium plan, you'll get access to every class on the platform, and it's less than $10 per month if billed annually. And for a limited time, Skillshare is offering you a free trial of their Premium membership. All you have to do is click the link in this video's description and sign up. So what are you waiting for? Check out Skillshare today and start learning something. It's clear that Microsoft Bob was plagued with a lot of problems, which ultimately led to its discontinuation just a year later in early 1996. But as crazy as it might seem to say, Bob was pretty ahead of its time. The idea behind the virtual assistant in particular, a social interface, was a fresh idea for the software company. Even though it was not the first implementation of a virtual assistant by any means, one could argue that it had an impact. The technology was even built on top of to create Microsoft Agent, which powered both Clippy and BonziBuddy, among other programs. I did videos on both of those if you're interested. Yeah, so maybe it doesn't have the greatest legacy, but a more interesting use for Microsoft Bob is when an encrypted copy of the program was used to fill up space on Windows XP's installation CD. This was done to prevent software piracy by having the setup program verify the presence of this data. This is technically the most successful use case for Microsoft Bob, and it's pretty funny that it was one where people didn't even know that they owned it. But its legacy can really make you think. What if the system requirements were more reasonable for the time? And what if the virtual assistant wasn't so intrusive? Most of all, what if Bob was a huge success and better received by consumers? Would we all be using a social interface like it on our computers today? Would it have evolved into an entire operating system? One can only speculate. But that's all for today's video. I want to thank you all very much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to give it a like and get subscribed, and as always, I will see you all in the next video.